Aragon? Well, give me Aragon. Alright, this looks like a well-loved copy. And I promise I'll give it back. I have a few copies of my own, so, you know. Okay. Let me get a grip on this without tearing it apart. So, I'm going to read you the very first line of the very first chapter of the very first book of the Inheritance Cycle. Okay, here goes. Wind howled through the night, carrying a scent that would change the world. Okay. You got eldest? Bring it on up. Now, one of my absolute favorite parts of working on this series was creating the various imaginary languages for it. And there are a number of different languages, but the two main ones are, of course, the ancient language, the elf language, and the dwarf language. Now, I'm going to read you a blessing in ancient language, elf blessing, but I have to apologize, because I have an absolutely atrocious elvish accent. Mainly because in ancient language you are supposed to roll your R's on the tip of your tongue as you would in Spanish or Italian. And I can only roll my R's by, and I know this sounds horribly obscene, I can only roll my R's by wiggling my uvula. So, I'm going to wiggle my uvula at you guys, and I hope you like it too. Atra sterni om veldoen, paranriva unitarta onder, undu everina onovarda. That said, my absolutely favorite language is definitely the Dwarvish, mainly because I came up with it from scratch, and it's a good, meaty language you can just sink your teeth into. And unlike the ancient language, I actually have an excellent Dwarvish accent. And that's because in Dwarvish you are supposed to roll your R's by wiggling your uvula. So, let the wiggling commence. Born Frethkarach, born Jürgen Karmiter, dos ega Goroth Bastarnog, dur incesti Rakkitten, Joch is Warad as Barzulador, dur Durgrins as Schwilden Rock Anwin, Mog Torak Jürgen Brand. What does that mean? What does that mean? You'll have to read the book. Look it up in the back. Okay, who's got a... Bring it on up. Gee, it's almost like you know what order the books are in. Alright, so, as you might have noticed, Bersinger, the third book, is a rather large book. And like most rather large books, it has a lot of sentences in it. And I'm actually very fond of quite a number of those sentences. In fact, there's one of them which involves a bombulating bumblebee, which I rather like. Although I probably should have cut it during editing, but I couldn't bring myself to do that. But among all these many sentences, there's one that's my absolute favorite. And I think it just is a really well-written sentence, and that really has a lot of literary merit. So, I want to read you my favorite sentence from Bersinger. All right, you want to hear it? Yeah. Die, puny human! I mean, because really, what's the point of writing fantasy if you can't write lines like die, puny human every now and then? Okay. Yes, I'm a very silly person at heart. Okay, so, last one. I'm going to... Whoops, wrong page. You're on page 7, aren't you? Or there's a bookmark there. Well, I may have lost your place. Okay. I'm going to read you guys a little bit longer excerpt from book 4. And this is from the end of the very first chapter of the last book of the Inheritance Cycle. And if you've not read any of the other books, or you haven't read book 4, don't worry, there aren't any spoilers in this. So I hope you enjoy this. Here it goes. The sound was stabbing, slicing, shivering, like metal scraping against stone. Aragon's teeth vibrated in sympathy, and he covered his ears with his hands, grimacing as he twisted around, trying to locate the source of the noise. Saphira tossed her head, and even through the din, he heard her whine in distress. Aragon swept his gaze over the courtyard 2 separate times before he noticed a faint puff of dust rising up the wall of the keep from a foot-wide crack that had appeared beneath the blackened, partially destroyed window where Blodgarm had killed the magician. As the squeal increased in intensity, Aragon risked lifting one of his hands off his ears to point at the crack. "Look!" he shouted to Arya, who nodded in acknowledgement. He replaced his hand over his ear. Without warning or preamble, the sound stopped. Aragon waited for a moment, then slowly lowered his hands, for once wishing that his hearing was not quite so sensitive. Just as he did, the crack jerked open wider, spreading until it was several feet across, and raced down the wall of the keep. Like a bolt of lightning, the crack struck and shattered the keystone above the doors to the building, showering the floor below with pebbles. The whole castle groaned, and from the damaged window to the front of the keep, from the damaged window to the broken keystone, the front of the keep began to lean outward. "Run!" Aragon shouted at the Varden, though the men were already scattering to either side of the courtyard, desperate to get out from under the precarious wall. Aragon took a single step forward, every muscle in his body tense, as he searched for a glimpse of Roran somewhere in the throng of warriors. At last, Aragon spotted him, trapped behind the last group of men by the doorway, bellowing madly at them, his words lost in the commotion. Then the wall shifted and dropped several inches, leaning even further away from the rest of the building, pelting Roran with rocks, knocking him off balance, and forcing him to stumble backward under the overhang of the doorway. As Roran straightened from a crouch, his eyes met Aragon's, and in his gaze, Aragon saw a flash of fear and helplessness, quickly followed by resignation, as if Roran knew that no matter how fast he ran, he could not possibly hope to reach safety in time. A wry smile touched Roran's lips, and the wall fell.